Perek Vav Mishna Aleph. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol Oisik B'Torah Lishma, Zoiche L'Dvorim Harbe. If a person learns Torah Lishma, L'Shem Shamayim, he's zoiche to many, many great attributes, many great things. And the Mishnah lists a whole long list, and it continues towards the end of the Mishnah. V'Noisenes Lo Malchus, and this gives him Malchus Umemsholam. He has royalty and dominion, v'chikur din, umigalm loy rozei Torah, and it's revealed to him the secrets of the Torah. V'nase kimayna mizgaber, chanar sheina poisik, v'havitzanua ve'erach ruach hamoichel el boina. And then the Mishnah concludes, migadaltai emeramamta akol hamasim, and it elevates him above all of the creation. So what is being added with this last phrase? It already says that it gives him malchus, umemshalta. The malchus, umemshala, that elevates, that raises above all, the king, royalty. That is the highest level, that's above all. So what is being added, umegaltam or mamtal kolamasim? It already says that it gives him malchus, umemshala, v'chikur din, and all of the great attributes that it gives him. So what is the addition? What is this addition of Megalta Umermamta Kolamasim? We know in Parshas Bolak, we know the mice of Bilam and the Chamor. Now, Bilam was one of the greatest Nevi'im. His level of Nevuah was above all. He was a Navi of Umas HaOlam, of the nation. And his level of Nevi'as was above all. Who reached that level of Nevuah, of prophecy, of Bilam? Chazal tell us in Gemara Brachas that only Bilam, was able to determine the precise split second when the Rebbeinu Shalom, so to speak, Kivyachol, was angry. And therefore, he had a great power to curse, an incomparable power to curse, because he and only he was able to determine that split second when the Rabbi Shalom, so to speak, Kivyachol, was angry, had kas. And yet, we learned in Pirkei, we're taught that Bilam was a disgusting person. The attributes of Gaiva, of Taiva, they're all attributed to Bilam. He was a disgusting person. The opposite of Avram Avinu, who was a Baal Chesed and was an Onav. Bilam was an awful person. And yet he was Zoicha to this level of Nevuah. How does that work? Isn't a Navi someone who is so exalted and so great that he is attached to the Rebbeinu Shalom, cleaves to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and the words of Hashem are transmitted through him? A further question about Bilam. What is this whole episode with the donkey, with Bilam's Chamor? This great nace, this unbelievable nace that this donkey is speaking. The donkey talks. And he gives Bilam Musa. And he reprimands him. But because he embarrassed Bilam, they had to kill the donkey. This donkey that was, as Pirkei, as Chazal tell us, that was created Misheshimei Bracious, it was such an unusual and unbelievable creation that the donkey is communicating with the boss of Adam, this great nace, and what's the point of it all? He speaks to him, he gives him Musa, and then he's killed. What is the Torah teaching us with this lesson, with the donkey of Bilam. And perhaps the lesson is that the donkey spoke, not because the donkey had intelligence, not because the donkey was more than a behemoth, than a donkey. It spoke because the Rebbeinu Shalom put words in its mouth. So the donkey was, so to speak, no more than any device that's used to transmit sound. It's no different than a microphone. It's no different than a recording. The donkey is a donkey. He spoke not because of intelligence, not because of his midas tayvais. He spoke because the words were transmitted through the donkey to speak to Bilam. And after that was accomplished, he was killed because at the end of it all, he still remained a donkey. And for a behemoth to embarrass a Basar Vadam, it was not bekovadik, so he had to be put to death. And maybe that's a lesson that Chazal was teaching us. That Chazal was teaching us with the Nevuah of Bilam. The Nevuah of Bilam was an awful person. He was a disgusting person. He was a menuvel. He was a Baal Taiva. He was an awful menuveldik person. But he had Nevuah. That type of nevuah that he had, that Bilam had, that type of nevuah is not the nevuah that Nevi'ei Yisrael have. That nevuah that he had was because the Rebbeinu Shalom put those words through his mouth, not because he was an exalted person, but he was a device to transmit messages. He was simply a device to transmit messages. And that was the nevuah of Umas Ha'olam. That was the level of their nevuah, nothing more than that. As opposed to Nevi'ei Yisrael, that nevuah comes because they are so exalted and they are mechubar, attached to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And therefore the words of the Rebbeinu Shalom are passed through them, not as a device to transmit, not as a recording device, not as a microphone, but because they are a chelik elokay mimal, because they are exalted and they are attached to the Rebbeinu Shalom. They are an extension, so to speak, of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that's the fundamental difference between the nevuah of Umas Ha'olam and the nevuah of Nevi'ei Yisrael. And that demonstration, that's what's demonstrated through the chamor of Bilam, through that donkey, that it remained a donkey. And that's what it's teaching us about Bilam. But Klal Yisrael is different. Nevi'ei Yisrael is different. And someone who learns Torah Lishma is different. And what Chazal is telling us, what the Mishna is telling us, is that a person, Kol Oisek B'Torah Lishma, yes, he has Malchus, he has all kinds of attributes. He has power and glory, and he has all kinds of great things. He's also Umagalta Umarmanta Kol Hamaisim. He becomes exalted. He becomes a greater person. The Torah transforms him. The learning of the Torah is not simply an intellectual exercise. It's not lahavdil like the Chachma Umas Ha'olam. The Torah, the Gemara, the Chazal tell us Chachma B'goyim Tamin. If you see that there's Chachma by the Goyim, believe that. They have Chachma. But that Chachma is an intellectual exercise. It's part of their intellect that does not transform their being. And they can become the same lowly people even with that intellect. They can remain the same menuvolim in spite, even with that intellect. But the Torah HaKadosh, if someone learns Torah Lishma, if he learns Torah Lishma, it transforms him, it elevates him, it raises him above, and he becomes a different person, an exalted person. It raises him. He becomes Meraimam, he becomes great and exalted. Several years ago, I was Menachem Aval by Rav Yitzchak Azrachi Shlita. The loss of his wife, which was a devastating loss. They had such a close relationship and he was so dependent on her. And I told him over that when Rav Chaim Zatzal, when he lost the Rebbetzin, he was totally dependent on his Rebbetzin, even for the most basic things. He was so immersed in his learning. Rav Chaim was so totally immersed in his learning, unaware of so many things in Olam Hazeh, Vinyonei Olam Hazeh. And he was dependent on her for so much, for everything. And the loss was a devastating loss. But interestingly enough, after that great, devastating loss, with time, his leadership of Klal Yisrael only grew and grew. And the Sar HaTorah became the Maneg of Yisrael, the Gadol Yisrael, the Maneg of Yisrael, even more and more, even after that devastating loss. The Torah elevates the person, gives him the ability to overcome nisyonos, that other people, even great people, even strong people, are not capable, are not able of withstanding. These types of emotional nisyonos, the Torah, learning the Shema, elevates him, raises him, becomes him greater. And he's able to assume things, even he was able to assume a leadership role even greater than before. The Torah made him, makes us more and great. And if I can add in a footnote, that a similar thing happened with the Rabbi Zrachi Shalita. The Torah, learning the Torah Lishma, elevates us, makes us great, makes us different people, bigger people, better people. That's what Torah Lishma does.